Hello, today on Knit TV I'm going to talk about the knit cast on. This particular cast on is often taught as the first cast on people learn, and you might wonder why I haven't put it in the beginners section, but one of the other things about this particular method of casting on is that it's very good for other parts of knitting. For example, here I've got some patchwork knitting, and it's also very useful for lace knitting. Quite often it's also called a lace cast on. I have actually done a simple piece of knit cast on here. However, this version of the knit cast on has been worked with the stitches in the back of the loop on the first row, so that you don't get the stretchy loopy edge, which is actually what you need when you're using the knit cast on for things like patchwork knitting and lace. The cast on is actually worked with 2 needles. So I've picked up my yarn and needles here. Start with a slip knot. So if we make the slip knot and put the slip knot on your left needle. We're now going to knit the cast on, which is very simple. So it's into the stitch, pull the yarn through, put it on the left needle. And I find it's easier to just leave the needle in the stitch to then take the yarn round the needle to form the next stitch. You can take the stitch off altogether and then go into the stitch again, but obviously if you just keep the needle in the stitch and pull it tight, it's much quicker to cast on this way. It's very similar to the 2 needle cast on that's demonstrated in the Learn to Knit section, but I'm going into the stitch rather than between the stitches, which is the method that's on the Learn to Knit cast on, which is called a cable cast on. So I'm just going to cast on a few more stitches, as I have done here. So when obviously you've cast on the number of stitches you need, if you were originally taught how to cast on like this, you may have been taught to then knit into the back of the stitch, as I am here. And this tightens up the cast on edge and gives you the edging that I've got here on this yellow sample. It gives you quite a tight cast on. It's a little bit of stretch to it, but it's quite tight, and it has the little pearl bumps along the edge. So that would be what would normally be thought of as the right side of that cast on. And if I turn this over, you've just got a fairly straight edge here. But I find that it can get a little bit too tight when you're working it through the back loops. And I'm in a situation where I'm just casting on to then knit a piece of another piece of knitting, for example, a garment, I'd actually use the cable cast on. But when I'm doing things like patchwork knitting, these pieces here, and lace knitting, particularly for this type of lace knitting, where the knitting is distorted, you want the edge, your cast on edge, to be able to stretch far enough to allow the knitting to push down into points. And this is where the knit cast on works very well. Having worked my knit cast on, if you just knit the first row normally, going into the front stitch you will find that you get these loops along the bottom edge. And the loops can look a bit unsightly, but they also allow the knitting to stretch. So you can pull the stitches quite wide if you need to. I'll just knit another row so that you can see them a bit better. As I say, for the lace knitting, you want the edge to be flexible so that it will allow your knitting to flow up and down. If you don't do a flexible cast on a piece of lace like this one, then your bottom edge will become very tight and it will cause it to distort. You'll also find sometimes in patterns which use lace that they suggest that you start with this particular cast on because you do have the loops at the cast on, and with some pieces where you're going to knit, for example, a border, you want to join the end of the knitting to the cast on edge. It's much easier to join to the loops than to a very tight cast on edge. I've just done another couple of rows, so you can probably see now that my cast on edge here is quite loopy, but that's in fact what I was wanting, because I want to be able to stretch the edge if necessary, or again go back and pick up through these stitches to knit in a different direction. And this is where the patchwork knitting in particular comes into play with this type of knitting, because patchwork knitting is about knitting one piece onto the next piece. So example here, I've cast on around two sides of the square. So the cast on edge has to stretch to allow me to knit a square. Again, if I'd knitted with a tight cast on, I'm not going to be able to stretch these two edges to make my square piece, and you'd actually end up with a slightly distorted square shape. But if I pick up this piece as well, I've knitted 4 squares here. So you start with the first square and cast on, and this is your cast on edge here. But I've then been able to cast on and pick up along the cast on edge of the first square to knit my next square. I then cast on and picked up along this cast on edge to knit this square, and then finally I picked up along 2 cast on edges to knit my 4th square. So that I've now got my mitered squares going out in each direction. To do that, it's much easier to pick up the stitches if I've got the loops, because you can easily see the stitches, pick up 1 stitch for each loop in order to then knit another direction. So it doesn't appear now to be a loopy stitch, it's just made it very easy to construct this piece of knitting. So if you want to have a go at the knit cast on, it's very simple cast on to do, and it's very useful for a variety of different techniques apart from just wanting to cast on to start some knitting. Have fun playing with that.